It's theory-based, but it's goal-oriented. So they like to think of this as an engineering thing, that we're trying to understand what's going on, but also change and improve. So we're engineering interventions, and we're testing them out in real-life settings. So they can break, and that's a good thing, because then we figure out how to make them better. So we adjust based on data, and we also think about some of the unexpected effects that can happen. This is all part of the research. My research questions, I have 6. We'll focus on the first 2 in this talk today. So the first question is, what is the pedagogical goal and why? My second question is, what is the intervention and why? So the research site that I chose is at a state research university, which will remain unnamed. I had 9 participating graduate student instructors who all had at least 3 semesters of teaching experience here at unnamed state research university. Right. There were a mix of native and non-native speakers who also had a mix of research interests, so it was a diverse group. They all taught lower division German. So their teaching development, as the literature says, they had pre-semester orientations, all had to take a methods course before they could start teaching or concurrently with their first semester, and they had observations from their supervisor. The context of the course is that they were 5 or 6 hours per week. Classes were up to 25 students per class. And they all had standardized syllabi and assessments across sections. So each section of each course had the same assessments and the same syllabi. And one thing to note is this included role plays that were the basis for the final oral exam. These role plays were dialogues between 2 students. So I had, for first semester, which I'm calling German 101, I had 3 participants. Second semester, German 102, had 5 participants. In the spring semester, that tends to be a course that gets more students. And then in the third semester, I had 1 participating grad student instructor. The data sources for my study, for the first 2 research questions, I did a literature review prior to doing an intervention. And for the research questions 3 through 6, I collected empirical data during the intervention. These included interviews, classroom observations, questionnaires, field notes that I wrote, so I took lots of notes about what was going on, and artifacts like emails, lesson plans, photos, and also 14 coordination meetings for each individual section it was for each individual course. So at this point of my analysis, I have done some initial analysis, which has been a holistic overview of the data. So I'll be presenting results from that, but I will continue using a grounded theory method in which I openly code for concepts. I'm looking through the data and letting concepts emerge. Then I'll look to broader themes, and perhaps I'll create a big theory of graduate student development and uptake. We'll see where this leads. And I might also look to case studies, either of individual instructors, individual types of instructors, or individual courses. Just a note about the trustworthiness and the rigor of the study. Many people who have not worked with qualitative research, they think that, well, we need numbers. But to tell how qualitative researchers work, some of the things that I did is that I triangulate from multiple data sources. I don't have just one data source. I also engaged in prolonged engagement. Previous to the data collection semester, I have been teaching in this study, in this setting as well, and also during the data collection semester, so I've been engaged in my site. I also did things like peer debriefing with my advisor, and I did member checking with some of my participants to make sure that the things I'm thinking of are things that they're agreeing with, and we're having a dialogue. So to the first research question, what is the goal and why? I look to teaching development for doctoral students. I'm actually going to speed through these slides, so I apologize for the profuse text. I can send you the slides if you'd like to see more details. But I really looked to a framework of graduate student instructor competencies that I focus on the pedagogical competencies. So things like here, how people learn and implications for teaching, how to communicate learning goals, looking at diversity and multiple perspectives in their courses, doing assessment and alignment with learning goals for student learning, also using a research-based signature pedagogy, so in our case, foreign language pedagogy that is research-based, and also thinking about one's own teaching practices. My second research question is what intervention and why? So I decided to do a semester-long teaching development on drama-based pedagogy. I'll speak a little bit to why I chose drama-based pedagogy, and I'll describe the intervention. So I chose drama-based pedagogy because these were practical activities rooted in learning theory, which I discussed before, and this speaks to helping graduate student instructors think about how people learn. Also, I use these activities and the reflections because they work towards student goals. These kinds of activities encourage diversity, and also because of this reflective DAR, that helps to unpack multiple perspectives. This pedagogy provides opportunities for authentic, formative, and summative assessments. So as an example, the poster dialogue that we did here, that can be used to do a more structured reflection, which is part of the curriculum in our setting. It also aligns well with foreign language pedagogy, which I'll speak to in the next slide. But finally, in thinking about one's own learning, having these new methods encourage reflection on one's own teaching. So drama-based pedagogy is helpful for language teaching. There are benefits in the general curricula, as we've seen in a meta-study from Bridget Lee. Transcultural learning, as wanted by the Modern Language Association report, the MLA report from 2007, it shows how students co-create and experience scenarios from different points of view. So we're working to get students thinking about transcultural, translingual, becoming global citizens. Drama-based pedagogy also addresses second language acquisition, which I saw somebody wrote on one of those posters. I wish we could unpack that more. But there are also research gaps in drama-based pedagogy in general, but also in the foreign language context. The intervention that I did is a 6-hour orientation workshop that I led over 2 days. And at this point, I would actually like to thank the Texas Language Center and also the Department of Germanic Studies for helping to fund the development of this intervention. So what I did with this workshop, I chose to do a workshop because it fit into the current curriculum of GSI development. It modeled drama-based activities and also how to facilitate them. So we did a really quick meta thing where we did an activity and then we reflected on it together. Then we reflected on how to do the activity and why you might want to do it. So there was a lot of meta in this workshop. So the content was, we first did the learning theories, we did an activity with that. We then moved to a model lesson plan that works for the second semester of German. We did it where I facilitated as the teacher and the other instructors were students. Then we stepped out of those roles where the other instructors could unpack what we did and think about it. The last thing we did was, on day 2, we did micro-teaching, where instructors taught one of the activities. So I had some handouts, which I also have with me if you'd like to have some. They tried those out in a community of practice, and then we reflected on what happened, what worked well, what didn't, and how they could improve. And then we did some lesson planning together. So during the rest of the semester, I did kind of a choose-your-own-adventure model, where I gave support throughout the semester as instructors asked for help, as I saw they could use help. So I started out by disseminating resources. I gave them literature on drama-based pedagogy and also on learning theory. I also developed and disseminated lesson plans that were specific to our curriculum. We also had a lot of discussion at coordination meetings, But even more, in the department, I was sitting in the graduate student lab working on something, and somebody would come talk to me about an activity they did, and we would dialogue about that. We also did this through email. There was also some co-construction of lesson plans, and I gave feedback on classroom observations that I did. So the initial results on the uptake, I noticed 3 categories of uptake. There were enthusiastic adopters of a few strategies. So we had 1 from the first semester, and then 2 from the second semester. So they took things, for example, lesson plans that I sent out, implemented those, and they were quite happy with that. We had 1 category, struggling adopter. This is somebody who was actually trying to do more difficult activities and who was having some challenges. And then there were 4 people who I call this critical adoption on their own terms. They were asking lots of questions, and I'll talk about this a little more. Things that they found challenging, but then they picked out some things and they also created some things on their own. There was 1 category of rejection, and this is notably in the 3rd semester, the 202 group, where I call this shut down and discouraged, and I'll talk a little bit about that. So there were a few people who used my lesson plans as is. I will move on quickly. A few others used more difficult ones, or they adapted ones. So here I'll talk about Timothy and Amber. Timothy actually implemented the lesson plan that I used as a sample. He implemented parts of that in his own second semester class. And this is an example of a poster dialogue that he did to modify to his classroom. So if you take a look at what we did and then what he has here, he used the chalkboard, and I can very much understand this because offices and teaching locations are across campus, and so people didn't want to schlep markers and tape and posters across campus. But I do feel like he successfully implemented this in his classroom using the materials he had. There were also some spontaneous role plays. Falcon and I co-developed a role play, and there were also 2 grad student instructors who developed full class role plays. Some of the challenges, though, to uptake, there was a lack of time in the curriculum. It was really full, but also this idea of teaching versus research. Doctoral students get their PhD based on a research dissertation. So in that case, in the academy, it is rewarded to focus on your research and maybe not as much on your teaching. Some of the activities I think were too risky or advanced. I have a question mark there because I'm still thinking about this. As an example, there's a technique called teacher enroll, where the instructor can become part of a role play. And nobody in this group did that, which I can understand. There was also some concern about alienating students. This came up in coordination meetings and through email. There was one instructor had concerns about mentally ill students or differently abled, that they might feel left out in certain cases. This is something we discussed. There was also the idea of derailers, so disinterested students who might try to destroy the activity. There are methods to deal with that, and we discussed. And there were 2 graduate student instructors who said, well, no touching. There's one activity in particular I showed them in which people are trying to grab each other's thumbs. See nodding here, somebody recognizes this. 2 of the instructors have problems with that, and they think that that amount of touching isn't okay, which is also a concern. Also, the physical classroom setup sometimes makes things difficult. As we see here, we have the posters back there. We have some space to move around. Not all classrooms have that much space. So a little bit about the rejection. I think what happened here, there were 2 non-participants who rejected drama-based pedagogy from the start. So I didn't collect data from them, but from our participant, Brandon, he, I think, mirrored what the others might have been thinking, that this particular course was difficult to teach. It was very content-based, and also that part in a student's development and their language learning, it's a difficult space to be in. This was a very packed curriculum. I would say it's more packed than the 101 and 102 courses. And what was interesting is that Brandon was active at the workshop. So he was really in fact, he was one of the more active participants, but the workshop focused on the 101 and the 102 courses. So there wasn't anything modeled for his content. So he actually tried to create a group role play. It was really interesting about different generations in East Germany. So he was thinking about a World War II generation person, somebody who had experienced East Germany and the oppression there under communism, and then somebody who experienced reunified Germany. He wanted to get them all together to have a conversation. But what happened is he abandoned this idea. And part of this was he had a lack of support in his cohort, also from me. I wasn't able to give the support that he needed. It was a risky and kind of culturally sensitive activity. So he just didn't have what he needed to make that succeed. And so he said in his interview he would have needed more teacher training and background reading, but he would have been interested in using some of these activities in an earlier context. So to return to my research questions, I've answered questions 1 and 2 here, and I've described what the uptake looks like. So I'll continue to analyze data to answer these other questions, but now I'd like to give the floor to my co-authors here. What they do is they look at research question number 5, and they're going to discuss an unanticipated positive effect that manifested itself in our first semester German course. Hi all. All right, so to give you some context about the first semester of German that me and Dakota took, it was really weird to come into a classroom and have, the first activity just like thrown out to us. We'd always been used to coming into a class and kind of, getting the old, cut and dry, like, this is the syllabus, like, let's go through the, semester, just, one by one, And instead, Devin had instructed us to kind of, sit down, get our bearings, and then grab a marker and write our responses to some questions on posters that were all around the room. And we all kind of just, quietly got up and like, went over and got in lines and like kind of wrote our little things. And so the questions that were on the posters were there was one that said, the German language is. There was one that said, the German, Swiss, Austrian cultures are. Language learning is. And a concern I have about German is. And so I'll be focusing on the shifts of one particular question, which is a concern I have about German is. Yeah. So the biggest shifts that we saw in the first time that we did the poster dialogue in the very start of the class versus we did it another time in the very end of the class, the last day. Exactly, it was set up the same way. We came in on the last day of school and we were instructed to do the same thing and write our response to the same exact question that we had gotten at the start. And yeah, as we were, going through and looking at the differences between, responses and stuff, we noticed some big shifts in, not only like the layout of like how we, answered, but also the content. So we noticed that there was a shift in general, like anxiety of like the class to like more specific parts of the German language. So instead of being, scared of at the start, pronunciation or what, someone's going to think of if I say something wrong or something like that, it was more specific of like hatred of like, here it says the dative case, which is pretty, objectively hard. But yeah, so that anxiety of like, oh, I'm going to pronounce it wrong, like being scared of that or what like the other students are going to think. We noticed that shift and that really, resonated with us. Another shift that we noticed was the actual layout of how we wrote our like responses down. So in the start, this is from the first day. We had all wrote our responses pretty small and like in line, and you can even you can notice that about y'all's handwriting too, or the organization of how you wrote y'all's responses. And on the last day, we noticed that the answers were more like splattered on, just kind of, some responses were, written kind of big and like, it was more of like a, just write wherever and like, nobody cared and stuff like that. And so it kind of showed us that there was a general change in feeling and comfort in the classroom. And I know that I definitely felt that, we didn't wait in lines and like, write our tiny little, answers. We just like, wrote whatever, and it felt like really awesome at the end, instead of kind of feeling scared and timid at the start. Yeah. So another big shift we noticed was on some of the other posters, we noticed that there was an increased usage of the German language to describe how we felt about the questions that were being asked or the statements that we were replying to. And you can check out those after we can unveil like the originals of the posters and see that shift. But yeah, there were a lot of shifts that we noticed from the first to the last day of German class. Yeah. So yeah, so these are just more shifts. Sorry. Yeah, but these are what we really noticed. Yeah, so a little bit about the setup of how we collected data and stuff. This was our data was collected from an introductory German class at UT. There were 23 students and 20 signed up to be a part of like the data collection and stuff. And basically at the end of the class, Devin approached Dakota and I and wanted to get us to help her with her research. And we were like, yeah, definitely, we love you, And so, yeah, we came together and we discussed and tinkered with 2 different questions that we were going to be focusing on answering with the data that we collected. And those questions were, did drama-based pedagogy contribute to a positive and safe classroom environment? And then another one that is kind of tangent to that. How did the classroom environment facilitated by drama-based pedagogy affect if and how students came out to their instructor and classmates? Yeah. So our main modes of collecting data were through test bonuses that were basically so we were given our tests, and at the end, a little test bonus question was tagged on, and basically the question that was asked was, describe an unusual activity that we did between tests that kind of affected the way that we learned German. And so the students were able to kind of like self-report what activities that we did that they felt were like unusual and like helped them, or maybe like kind of weirded them out, or whatever. But they were allowed to write whatever came to their mind whenever they thought about an unusual activity. And then the second the second biggest mode of like collecting data was we were given the chance to write structured reflections and kind of reflect on our journey through the first semester German class, and kind of self-report, how the activities that we did in class affected our journey through, this language that most of us had never really come in contact with. And then the last, mode of collecting data was all 3 of our personal statements, in which we kind of talked about how we were affected by, drama-based pedagogy through the German class and how it brought us all together as a research team. Oh, and then, yeah, sorry. So then we all got together, and with these data sources, we came together and we kind of took a few pieces of the data that we had, and we pulled out subjects that we thought really like stuck out and that we kept seeing, and we kind of made a code book of different little markers that we saw through the responses of the students that were in the class. And 3 examples of those are a positive group dynamic. So basically, if a student had said, oh, me and my group, we, it felt awesome to, do these role plays, and it felt awesome to, talk with each other and discuss things as a group, and it really helped my learning to be in this group setting. We would take note of that. There was one that was embodied, and it's basically how the role plays affected their learning. And so if they felt that, by actually embodying these characters during the role plays, if that helped or, affected their learning, we would take note of that. And then also another one was if they felt a challenge, and then through that challenge they felt growth through the drum-based pedagogy like activities. If they felt that they were able to grow as students and overcome their challenges, we took note of that. And yeah, we got a lot of findings with all those codes that we made. These are just 3 of them, but Dakota can tell you about the rest of the findings that we got. So yeah, thanks.
Hi y'all. So after rigorous analysis, we came up with a couple of very interesting findings. First, I want to talk about the structured reflections because these were a much greater window into the mindset of the students. They were about a page to 3 pages long, depending on who wrote them, and they really helped us see what they were feeling, how their journey went, what was important to them. This is as opposed to the test bonus questions, which were generally a sentence or 2 long and simply were used to note which activities stood out to the students. So when we looked at the structured reflection, we found an extreme shift away from the individual class experience. We had 3 across the course of this class. So we looked at the first structured reflection and compared it to the third. In the first, many of the students focused on themselves, how they were learning it, how they were memorizing things, and the challenges that they themselves were facing. Whereas in the third, it was much more of a community effort. There was a lot more mentioning of group dynamics, of working together, and of experiencing this class as a class and not as an individual. So the major themes that we saw here, these are just some of them. There was an increased mention of the social context of German usage, not just being able to memorize things, pronounce things, or remember the dative case, which we all hated, but using it in a social context with friends, family, or sometimes on the internet. Another one was comfort. The anxiety levels, like we mentioned at the beginning here, were certainly prominent in the first structured reflection. A lot of the students mentioned that they were fearful of beginning this class, whereas to the last structured reflection, it was much more of a community environment that they felt safe in. They mentioned that they felt safe, that it was okay to fail, that failure was a part of their learning, and it wasn't something to be fearful of for the judgment of other people if you mispronounced something, got a sentence wrong, or answered a question wrong. And finally, and this was really important to us, was a power dynamic. A lot of the students mentioned a very specific thing that happened, which was Devin's decision to, on the very first, or on the second day of class really, decide to use the du form with us, which in German there is the formal Sie and the informal du. And so by having her on our level and being able to speak to her in the same way that we were speaking to our peers really helped to level the playing field and make Devin not just our instructor, but our peer as well. She was assisting us by being engaged. So when it comes to the test bonus questions, they were more general in content, but they did note a lot of the DBP activities. They asked the students which ones were unusual or important to them, and many of them were DBP. One that I'd like to speak about specifically is the decision of Devin to include a role play based on these 2 verbs, kiffen and saufen. When we were introduced to these, we had no idea what they were. They're not normal vocab words included in a chapter, but specifically, kiffen is the German verb to smoke marijuana, specifically. Rauchen is to just smoke. And saufen, which is to drink to excess, rather than simply trinken, to drink. And this was a very pivotal moment in the class because it really broke down the taboo barriers. These are things that maybe not the students had personal experience with, and a lot of them did, but it was something that was generally not acceptable as an instructional environment. So it really helped to elevate the students, to encourage the students to speak about things, personal things, things that might not have been normal or expected. And this actually leads to the LGBT inclusion, which we really noticed in the class, myself included, is that Devin gave us during one of the immediately after this Kiffin-Salfin breakthrough, we had the test, and the next day we started a new chapter on family. And I'll just quickly go to this slide real quick to give you an example. She provided us with typical family verbs of ways of describing your family members, and alongside of it, not anything special or out, was, I'm sorry if you can't see, it was sexual orientation and identity words to identify family members, yourself, and whatever. Also, in conjunction with this, was a PowerPoint graciously provided by Connie Luce, which included a homosexual couple with an adoptive daughter. And this was a